Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining the North-South Dialogue Project's podcast. I'm Deepali from the Doing Sociology team. This podcast is produced by the collaborative work of the International Policy Institute of the University of Washington and Doing Sociology in India. Today, we have with us Vrinda Chopra, who will be talking to us about mediating social entrepreneurship for addressing development goals in South Africa and India, demonstrating entanglements of neoliberal economic logics and social missions. Welcome, Vrinda, to this podcast. Very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Deepali. Thank you for having me on the podcast, the North-South Dialogue podcast. And hello to everybody listening in. I'm Vrinda. I recently completed my Ph.D. at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I'm interested in questions related to development policy and practice in the global South and, of course, globally as well. So my PhD sort of sits in between economic geography and sociology. My work focuses primarily on social entrepreneurship, as Deepali introduced, given their popularity in development policy and practice in the global South and emerging economies such as South Africa and India. The aim of my research was really to understand the power relations that shape and direct entrepreneurship as a development response in the global South. And towards these ends, I sort of looked at intermediaries such as incubators in South Africa and India. In terms of looking at incubators or intermediaries, the focus was really to understand the entanglements that existed between neoliberal economic logics, such as market and finance, with social missions that social enterprises are oriented towards. So that's basically what my research really is about. And
right, Vrinda, so your topic is extremely interesting. What I'm curious to know is, how did you get interested in this area of research?
Right. So how did I get interested in this area of research? When I was a young professional starting out, I started working with a sustainable development think tank in India called Development Alternatives, in short DA. And at DA is where I got introduced to this idea of social enterprises. Till then, as a young professional, I generally viewed enterprises from a market or a profit lens. And so the fact that enterprises or social enterprises could be oriented towards social missions was very interesting to me. At DA, I was researching organizations that were supporting women in skilled construction work. So they were setting up self-help groups or enterprises based on self-help principles to address the socio-economic empowerment of women and livelihood concerns at the local scale. But these organizations that were supporting these women-led enterprises did not identify with the term social enterprise. They, in fact, shied away from it at the time because they associated social enterprises being primarily commercially driven in terms of their purpose, which made sense because in discourse there were organizations that were popular were those like D-Light, the solar company, that actively were oriented towards commercial imperatives, even though they had social missions or environmental missions attached to them, such as providing sustainable and accessible solar power, including to marginalized communities in India. So I was intrigued by this diversity in conceptualizing and practicing social entrepreneurship. During my MPhil, when I started looking at some of the academic scholarship, I saw that academia or management schools, basically in the global North, really saw on social entrepreneurship as hybridizing economic logics of market and finance, the commercial imperatives with social missions. So the focus was that economic logics could efficiently address social missions or address development goals. the discursive centrality in that sense was on economic logics. The economic logics became the central focus of social enterprises. And critiques of the field really was seeing the critiques of the field were drawing on this centrality of economic logics to call social enterprises or critique social enterprises as being neoliberal or furthering neoliberal power. But in practice, as I was talking about earlier, you could see that there were ongoing interactions between economic imperatives, financial imperatives, and the complexity of social missions. And so I became interested in seeing the kind of entanglements that existed between these different types of logics that drove social entrepreneurship, that sort of shaped development policy and practice in emerging economies of the global South. I was interested specifically in South Africa and India because of course, my personal connections to both countries, having grown up in India and studied in South Africa for my PhD. The real focus on these two countries was that they had similar post-colonial development trajectories, but they also had significant differences that made looking at both contexts interesting, and to build these epistemologies of the South in terms of understanding social entrepreneurship, in terms of understanding development really from a global South perspective. Finally, I wanted to, in that respect, contribute to scholarship that understood the pluralistic nature of development. I wanted to contribute to scholarship that problematized the centrality given to neoliberal logics by seeing logics of market and finance in relationship with social logics such as trust, morality, exchange, and so on. In this respect, of course, I was inspired by the work of Gibson Graham, Timothy Mitchell, Srila Roy, Julian Go, and of course my own supervisors, Shari Daya and Ruchi Chaturvedi. Yeah. Right. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And since you were just talking about India and South Africa and how your study focuses on both these countries, which have had a very similar developmental trajectory, right? But then you also talk about the differences. So could you maybe highlight some of the similarities and differences a little more in detail for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. As you rightly pointed out, broadly speaking, South Africa and India have similar post-colonial development trajectories, particularly with reference to the fact that their current development policies or their policies since the 1990s, in South Africa since the mid-1990s, can be characterized as neoliberal. Where the state attempts to encourage private sector investments, entrepreneurship to address development goals. In that respect, they actively shift focus on the private sector and responsibilities of development onto the citizens and away from the state. In terms of impact of these neoliberal policies, economic policies or development policies, you can also see that in terms of the issues, the development issues that are ongoing, such as both South Africa and India struggle with growing levels of inequality and unemployment. But there are distinctions here as well. In South Africa, these issues intersect with structural issues such as race. And in India, the intersections are with issues such as caste. In both countries, however, there are issues of age, gender, geography, in terms of rural, urban, those kind of distinctions. Further, based on while this broad emphasis is on neoliberal development trajectories, there are distinctions in policy and practice. I'll begin with South Africa. In South Africa, there's an explicit focus on economic empowerment to address apartheid era wrongs. So during apartheid, access to economic opportunities was based on race. And so South Africa's flagship Black economic empowerment policy attempts to address these historical wrongs. the focus of the policy is explicitly on encouraging corporate and private sector investments for enterprise development. They do this through by providing policy incentives, such as enterprise development points that corporates can cash in on. The focus on economic empowerment in terms of the broad policy translates into practice as social missions that are focused on employment generation and addressing the high levels of unemployment that plague the country even today. And corporates in that respect don't work with the enterprises directly. They need intermediaries or incubators to sort of step in between. And there's this huge influx or emergence of enterprise support providers, incubators, intermediaries of all kinds that assist CSR initiatives in setting up enterprises to address employment needs on ground within marginalized communities. And in that respect, these intermediaries also aid the CSR initiatives to gain their policy incentives. In India, in contrast, there are a range of policy mechanisms. There's no explicit focus on entrepreneurship or economic empowerment, but there are a range of policy mechanisms, structures, departments that implicitly promote entrepreneurship through their work. For instance, the Department of Science and Technology promotes technological innovation through entrepreneurship. There's Startup India, the digital platform focused primarily on intermediaries. And there's Atal Innovation Mission and other such mechanisms amongst ministries that are focused primarily on entrepreneurship. So sitting alongside all these mechanisms, structures, etc., the state structures is the Companies Act, where in India, companies are mandated to invest in CSR initiatives. So they're not incentivized, unlike in South Africa, but they're mandated to invest in CSR initiatives. However, companies are given a wide berth for interpretation in terms of their CSR priorities, in terms of interpreting it as poverty alleviation, health, or education, as the corporate, the CSR initiative would be interested. There's also this movement towards entrepreneurship in India. There's also this sort of focus on emulating structures in the global north, such as the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial systems. Incubators in India or intermediaries in India that are emerging and existing ones that are attached to universities, etc. They want to draw on these CSR mandates or this newly available investments through CSR to set up high growth technology-based enterprises that can address social missions. So there's a huge focus on social enterprises that can be characterized as fintech, agri-tech, ed-tech, and so on. So broadly, this was a lot. So like in South Africa, the focus is really on addressing demands of economic empowerment and unemployment by incentivizing corporate funding and investment. In contrast, in India, the emphasis is really on building scalable enterprises that emulate technology-oriented entrepreneurship systems in the global north, such as Silicon Valley. And the focus of these enterprises, these technology-based enterprises, is to address broad development imperatives, such as poverty alleviation, education, or health. Right.
All right. So, in your research, I think you argue that one needs to look at the relationship between the universal and the specific practices, right, or the specificities of practice when you're talking about neoliberal development, right? So what I would like to know from you is how do you see this relationship, and why do you see the need for emphasizing on the relationship between the two?
Right. That's a very interesting question and an important one related to my research. You're right. I do look at the relationship between the universal and specific, and I'll try to explain this best I can. Development is becoming neoliberal in nature. That's a truism. It's an issue that has plagued or has been looked at in critical development studies, even in social entrepreneurship literature that is based in management schools of the global north. There is an active concern that social enterprises are contributing to neoliberal power. So these are issues that these are issues that concern a lot of the they concern a lot of the organizations they concern academics as well as practitioners in both the global north as well as the global south. And the fact that development is becoming neoliberal is based on this issue that there's a growth of private sector and corporate investments to fund and support development initiatives. So development becomes, in that sense, commodified, financialized, depoliticized, and the broad institutional level of development of state, multilaterals, bilaterals, philanthropy, global civil society, they create the material basis for the promotion of private sector investments and entrepreneurship. At the level of practice, and this is, just another point there, the logic for creating the material basis for promoting entrepreneurship or private sector investments is really based on the fact that we are running short of funds to address the sustainable development goals. At the level of practice, intermediaries sort of work with enterprises to train them to become worthy to receive the available financial investments. So the intermediaries create the channels for finance and capital to sort of flow. Enterprises in that respect need to be able to use the funds effectively and efficiently, or prove that they can use it effectively and efficiently. Concentrating on these details, however, the fact that there are financial flows that are taking place, intermediaries are encouraging this flow to occur, leads to an outlook that reifies the centrality of neoliberal economic logics. But practice at the level of intermediaries that attempt to create the channels for capital to flow is highly nuanced and ambivalent in nature. It's the reason why I focused on intermediaries, because they lie in between the broad perspectives that focus on financial logics or economic logics and promote entrepreneurship as a development tool. And they lie in, and at the other end are the enterprises that deal with the complexities of their social missions on ground. So intermediaries in that respect become fertile ground to be able to see the interconnections between this broad focus on economic logics and the complexity, the nuances of addressing social missions on ground. And in practice, intermediaries such as the incubators, they often grapple with issues such as addressing financial due diligence as of their corporate investors, as well as the need to build the trust with the entrepreneurs that they're working with. An example is where in South Africa, an incubator was really struggling with building trust with the entrepreneurs that they were working with. And the financial due diligence processes of the corporate investor made it difficult in terms of because of the delays caused in providing financial support to the entrepreneurs. the issues that would have come up were in terms of dropouts of the entrepreneurs. And if the entrepreneurs dropped out, the work that the intermediaries were focused on in terms of addressing employment needs in the community would have been compromised. So intermediaries recognize that the focus on either these broad financial needs or concerns, as well as the excessive complexities that they deal with on a regular basis in terms of their social missions, focusing on either or will compromise the entire process, or compromise the entire the focus of the work that they are doing. So in that respect, it's important to look at the relationship between the universal and the specific, and to transcend these binaries, simply because there are tensions that arise in the interrelationships, exactly in the relationship between the universal and the specific. In this case, between the broad emphasis on economic logics and the complexities of social missions. And and as those tensions arise, there are negotiations that take place, and being able to see these negotiations, there is ability to displace that centrality of economic logics by seeing it in an ongoing and uncertain relationship with social logics such as trust, in the example that I was talking about just now. And again, in transcending the dichotomies or the binaries of the universal and specific, there are possibilities that arise to not see social entrepreneurship as solely neoliberal in character, to be able to recognize the pluralities that exist in practice in different contexts, such as South Africa and India, and to neither sort of lead to this sort of conceptualization of social entrepreneurship as the panacea of social change, or a kind of pessimistic outlook that they're just neoliberal tools. And in this respect, I'll borrow from the work of Srila Roy, and to say that intermediaries can be seen as entrepreneurial, financialized, as well as agents of social change in the context of the global South.
That's extremely interesting what you've just discussed with us. Now, our final question to you, Vrinda, is regarding your field work. You've done your field work in intermediaries such as entrepreneurship incubators. Could you share your experience of carrying out your fieldwork in such a space, and also maybe some of the challenges that you faced while doing your fieldwork?
Yeah, sure. So incubators are they're basically enterprise support providers. That's how they're characterized generally in South Africa and India. I've come to prefer the broad term of intermediaries simply because in the context of South Africa and India, there was a lot of divergence from the ideal type of what an incubator is. In terms of an incubator is generally seen as an organization that provides a lot of hand-holding and business support and financial support over a long period of time, generally 2 to 5 years. But in practice, in both South Africa and India, incubators did not relate to these ideal types. And so just simply identifying intermediaries to work with was challenging in the first instance, because I came with that idea of an ideal type of an incubator, whereas in practice there was a lot of diversity that needed to be accounted for. So an ethnographic study of incubators was challenging also from the point of view that both South Africa and India had a lot of these organizations. There were new ones were emerging, there were existing ones. And so there needed to be some kind of basis to select these organizations in both countries. To engage with too many would mean that I would dilute the depth of the analysis, and to engage with not enough of them meant I'd probably get engrossed in too many details that could lead to narrowness in the research. So to address some of these concerns, I decided to draw on a purposive sampling technique with some funneling. What I mean here is that I started with the purpose in mind. I sought out intermediaries or incubators working with social enterprises and social missions related to poverty alleviation and dignified livelihoods. This was broad enough to give me a wide base to begin with. And I spoke to several organizations in both countries before narrowing down on two, each in South Africa and India, with whom I could engage with more deeply, where I attended their internal events, their conversations and engagements with the entrepreneurs. I conducted several interviews. I sat in on their internal management meetings and the like based on their level of comfort. It was challenging, one, because I needed to do this work in two different countries. And what happened was I needed to figure out a kind of system where I could ensure that there was engagement with organizations in the other when I was doing field work in the first. So I started with South Africa. But while I was starting in South Africa, I was trying to build relationships with incubators in India to pave that path when I moved field site to India. And at the same time, when I moved the field site to India, I was maintaining my relationships with the organizations I looked at in more depth in South Africa to be able to understand changes and shifts over time. A lot of this took a lot of relationship building because levels of trust with these intermediaries or incubators were low. Working with social enterprises usually come with the issue of balancing financial imperatives with social missions, and conveners and employees, they find these questions to be very difficult to engage with. There's a kind of whether they've managed to find a consensus in terms of what is an optimum balance between financial goals or social missions. And if they haven't figured this out, then they're very uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about these kind of issues. I also recognize that my gaze as a researcher was very, very significant during the process of research. I often had to figure out ways of framing my questions that did not make the interviewee or the person I was engaging with uncomfortable. I needed to find new ways of asking questions. I needed to rephrase a lot of questions. At times when I was observing their meetings or attending some internal events they were having with entrepreneurs, I wasn't always able to take notes because I noticed that it led to some discomfort. In one of the early events, in fact, in South Africa, there was a person who used me as an example. They were finding it difficult to build trust with the entrepreneurs that they were working with. And so he brought me up as an example in the sense that he's like, I understand that the entrepreneurs don't want the coaches or the mentors to come to their place of work. They don't want them to look at their accounting books, their business books, their inventories, etc. Because it makes them feel exposed, just like I feel exposed when there's a researcher in the room making notes, observing me at my place of work. So he was trying to make this point that it's uncomfortable for everybody and it's a universal feeling, but you should open up to the process of being supported by them as an incubator. So, in the end, it really became about building those relationships, being open about what I was observing, being asking for clarifications, being genuinely curious about their work. It also enabled certain shifts in me as a researcher. I started the research with this perspective in mind that, of course, the intermediaries and, of course, social entrepreneurship is neoliberal in character. They are mostly concerned about their financial goals. But to engage with their work made me realize that how much the intermediaries cared about their impact, their social missions, the work that they were doing. And it's really in these in-between moments of doing ethnography that I could really start to shift my perspective and contribute to the thesis that neoliberal economic logics are actively entangled with the complexities of social missions.
Well, thank you so much, Vrinda, for sharing your experiences, sharing your research with us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into the North-South Dialogue. If you want to be a part of this podcast, write to us with a brief introduction about yourself and your research to nsdialogue@uw.edu. Thanks again, everyone. See you in the next podcast.